Hello all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends where you're from. We always have a pretty diverse geographic group in here. So it looks like we have good numbers so far. Um, it seems as though my audio is working okay. If you can hear me, you can just give a quick mention. A couple people in the chat just to be sure. But if you are having trouble backing out of Zoom, or if you have external hardware, unplugging and plugging back in, we usually get you connected. So if you do need to leave, you can always come back. This isn't closed. There's no waiting room. So it should be easy for you to get back in if you need to. I'm Clark Holdsworth. I'm going to bring in Dr. Avriel Licciardi in just a minute. She's going to introduce herself. I want to welcome all of you who've been with us before back. We have another great webinar set up for you now. If this is your first time, I'm going to go over some of the details that are going to help you with the logistics, because I'm sure many of you have questions about things like recording. So to start off with that, since we are on Zoom, we always have this recording available for you on demand. Okay, so at the end of this, there is going to be the recording will get rendered. We'll go ahead and save that. Once it's ready, it's going to get sent to you automatically in a follow-up email from Zoom within 24 hours. So just give it 24 hours and you will get the follow-up recording. In addition, in that email, what we're going to do is make sure to include a certificate of completion for you. Those certificates are available only as is, what we have on there. So that will come. You just click the link. It takes you to a page with a certificate for this specific webinar with the name and date. So if you need that for anything, that'll be available to you. So recording certificate will be sent to you automatically after this. If you don't get it after 24 hours, you can go ahead and send us an email. So with that, I will be monitoring the chat for most of this session. The topic that you can see that we have here today, essential academic documents to ensure career success. Dr. Licciardi is going to be going through a lot of content for you today. This should be a really popular one, I think, amongst our viewers. This is the type of detailed stuff that we can get into that's going to, I think, be quite helpful. So if you try to stick around for the whole thing. We'll be aiming to keep it under an hour like we always do. It just depends how many questions we have, because we do like to answer as many of those as possible. Another final reminder before I move into our introductions is what we're doing now with these webinars is we're always going over to PeerRef. That's PeerRef.com. So if you go visit PeerRef, it's just a quick sign in with an email address. What we do is we host a LetPub webinar open discussion there. So any questions we don't get to, or if you want to have one-on-one help and go back and forth with AV and myself there, we can get all your questions answered, particularly if you have specific questions about a problem you had with a journal, dealing with a cover letter, something like that. So be sure to visit afterwards. There's a hub in there if you just go to the Connect page, and that's going to have a whole discussion forum where AV and I try to follow up in the week or month that follows between our webinars. So I think we can get right into it now, AV. So just as a brief introduction for myself, this is my background. I'm Dr. Clark Holdsworth. I'm the Research Communications Manager at LetPub. My background is the life sciences, which is something to keep in mind. AV will give you her background, but that sort of colors a lot of what we'll discuss in terms of cover letter and some of these documents. But I have a doctorate in physiology. My area is the study of oxygen transport, all the way from ambient air down through the lungs and all the way to the very low PO2s and muscle myoglobin. And I worked primarily with models of dysfunction such as chronic congestive heart failure. So that's a bit of my background. Now I want to bring in AV, and she's going to give you an idea of where she's coming from, because she's going to be explaining a lot to you with essential documents today.
Well, thank you, Clark, for the wonderful introduction. And again, thank you to all the attendees and participants joining us today. Again, my name is Dr. Avriel Licciardi. You guys can call me AV. I'm the Research Communication Strategist here at LetPub. And before joining the scholarly publishing world and working for LetPub, I was a geologist at heart. So I got my master's and my PhD in the geological sciences. So a background quite different from Clark's. But again, because we're all academics, we go through a lot of the same processes throughout our academic careers. And that's what we're here to talk to you about today. So yeah, that's my background, and I'm happy to jump into the content for today, which is regarding these essential academic documents. And what I really mean by this are documents that you're going to be using throughout your academic career. So these are usually important and necessary files that you'll use not just to bolster your own career and kind of advertise yourself like your CV, but also the cover letter that you'll likely submit with each of your manuscripts, the response to reviewers document that you'll be going through after every manuscript that you submit goes through peer review, and also just some general tips on how to be professional with your emails, because email communication is by far the most popular form of professional communication these days. So really being professional and showcasing yourself as a worthy colleague is something that you want to focus on. So those are going to be kind of the 4 main sections of today's webinar. And like Clark mentioned, we will be having an extensive Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So if there are any questions that you have that are related to any of the information presented today, please input your questions into the Q&A function that's part of Zoom, and we'll address those questions once we get to the end of the presentation. Remember, if you see that someone else has already asked your question in the Q&A, all you simply need to do is upvote that question instead of rewriting the same question again. The more upvotes a certain question has, it'll go to the top of the list, and we'll be sure to answer those questions first and foremost. But like Clark said, we'll try to get to all the questions if we can within this hour. So in terms of the basics and the reason why we wanted to put this webinar together is because these professional documents really do impact whether you achieve academic or career success. As I noted, professional communication is essential to everyone's career. So whether you're in academia, in industry, or outside of both of those realms, it's important and necessary to draft kind of these fundamental files. And they're truly important for success in higher education, not just obtaining a job, but also working with your publishing documents, but really in general with whatever career you decide to move forward with. Importantly, a well-written document, one that is professional, really showcases who you are. So not only that you're a competent researcher or scientist, but also that you're likely to be a worthy colleague or an excellent employee if you're applying for a job. And while today we're going to provide you with some templates to get you started, to give you that overall structural framework of each document, it's really important to understand that each of these documents must be tailored to that specific objective of the time. So for example, you're always going to be updating your CV. So it's probably always going to be about 95% done, but that last 5% is going to be making sure that you're adding your recent publications, your recent conference abstracts, or those service roles that you've been working on. And also paying attention to the guidelines for when you're submitting your CV. Most often than not, you're not going to have to cut it down, but for some grants, for example, they'll only allow 2 to 3 pages of a CV, and your CV might be 10 pages long normally. So it's important to really tailor these documents to the objectives at the time. So let's jump into one of the most important academic documents, which is your curriculum vitae or your CV. So in general, a CV highlights your education, your research and your teaching experience, the number of publications that you have, so your publication record, any grants and fellowships that you've received, and this is specifically important for teaching positions. You'll also be able to highlight your professional associations and any sort of special licenses that you have that might make you stand out from others. And a CV is also you really advertising yourself. So you want to indicate any honors and awards that you have. And importantly, as I said before, you want to tailor this to what you are submitting your CV for. And so if you have any other details that really show that you're the best candidate for your position, you want to add those to your CV as well. So regarding some tips for writing a CV, importantly, you should always think about length. One main difference between a CV and a resume is length. Resumes are often limited to 1 to 2 pages maximum, but a CV can really be any length. And that's because you usually want to include every publication that you've ever had to really show how productive you are as a scientist in academia. However, as I noted just previously, page limits may exist for certain jobs or proposal applications. So just like you would check the guidelines for submitting a manuscript to a journal, you want to check the guidelines for your application or for your proposal. It's also important to consider the document structure. So for CVs, the most important information should be at the top, and this often includes your education, your employment history, so that's your teaching or research experience, and then your publications. And importantly, these should be in reverse chronological order, so the most recent comes first. So in terms of your education, for me, my most recent degree obtained was a PhD, so I would list that first. That would be followed by my master's and then my bachelor's education. And another thing that you can include in your CV, which is a little bit similar to a resume, is a personal statement. Again, this is something that's optional, but if you do decide to include a personal statement, it should be the first thing that occurs underneath your contact information at the top. And this is a place where you can really make your CV stand out. You can highlight what you want as a researcher for your career, why you're the best candidate, etc. Some other tips are just like any sort of presentation you give, you want to consider your audience. Importantly, you must keep an up-to-date CV. This kind of might sound like a very easy task, but it's oddly easy to fall behind in keeping up to date with your CV, and that might risk you forgetting to add a certain publication that you had that perhaps you were a co-author on, conference abstracts, things like that. So a good tip is to always update your CV after any conference presentation or after any publication. In academia, again, you always want to tailor your CV to the job or your audience. And one of the main kind of questions is that you should ask yourself is, what kind of position are you applying for? Is it research or is it teaching? If it's teaching, then you're going to want to put your teaching experience above your research experience so that the reader reviews your teaching experience first, because that most aligns with the position you're seeking. It's important to always seek feedback from your colleagues. You should have someone review your CV. You can have this be your peers that are in your laboratory, or it could be your advisor or your mentor. There's also very likely career help associated with the institution that you're researching at. And oftentimes they have people that will review your CV for you. And this will be a completely objective review. So very helpful, someone outside the community giving you feedback. And that's usually free. Just like a manuscript, it's important to be consistent with your CV. So be conscious about your formatting. It relays a very polished CV, and that'll indicate that you have attention to detail as an employee or a researcher. And then finally, it is essential to carefully edit your document. Your CV must be error-free, and this will really indicate that you are a professional, polished individual, and you are serious about your career. So please take the time and make sure that your CV and pretty much all of the other documents I'm going to talk about today are error-free, so no grammatical or spelling mistakes. So those are the tips for the CV. Right now, I want to jump into a template. So I've put this template into PowerPoint form. So just think about this being the top of the page that you're reading for a CV, and every other slide I show kind of being the information that follows in logical order. So at the top of your CV, again, you want to make sure that you have your name, your department and university address, and then your contact information. Most importantly, make sure that your correct email address is there, because that's very likely how you're going to be contacted by anyone who's interested in working with you after seeing your CV. After that, you can have that career objective section or that summary statement. Again, this is optional, but it's where you can highlight why you are the best candidate for the position. After that, you should list your education. Again, this should be in reverse chronological order. And you can add a little bit of detail here. You want to add the location, the name of the institution, the degree you earned, and your date of graduation. And if applicable, so if you are going into academia and you want to illustrate what your dissertation was about, it's also okay to put your dissertation title as well as the advisors. Following education is where you're going to put your employment history. So in academia, this is likely going to be called teaching experience or research experience. This should also be listed in reverse chronological order. So if you have postdoctoral training, that would be listed first, and then below that, your PhD training, and then below that, your master's and undergraduate training. Again, this should be fairly brief, but you can add a little bit of details, what your position entailed, what your primary responsibilities were. Following this section should be fellowships and grants. This is important in academia to show that you can obtain money for research in the future. This should include the organization, the title, the dates that you had, and it is important and okay to also include the amount of money awarded for each grant. This is a place where you can basically impress your readers of your CV if you have obtained one really big grant with a lot of money, or perhaps numerous small grants that really added up. So don't be afraid to put all the money that you've been awarded. In addition to that, you also want to do honors and awards. Importantly, this is not where you want to list that you were on the honor roll, for example. That's something that is, that would be something associated with an undergraduate level. So if you have an honors or awards, this might be that you were the top researcher in your department, or that you received a fellowship associated with a society or an organization. Those are what you want to include here. So honors and awards that are related to your scientific work. Following this will be a very large part of your CV, which is where you list your conferences and presentations. This should include anything from an invited talk to a normal oral presentation or to a poster. You can always highlight whether or not it was invited or what kind of talk it was. And sometimes you can format it where you put your name in bold for each of these to indicate your contributions. Service is a section that young early career scientists might not have as much, but this is where you would put any sort of outreach components that you have. If you are a little bit further down in your career, this is where you could indicate how many students that you've advised. If you've been in any administrative role, such as chair of the department, you'd want to highlight that here. And that would be followed by any licenses. So any certifications or anything like that can be a little bit outside the box here, just to showcase that you are skilled in a variety of different ways. And then lastly, publications. That will be another large section in addition to presentations. And here you want to be complete in your publication listing and consistent in your formatting. So the same way that you would be writing a reference list in a way for a manuscript, you want to follow those same rules. So include all of the information necessary. And the way that your CV will round out is you can have your professional affiliations listed. So these are the organizations that you belong to. You can have an optional skills or interest section. This is another kind of parallel to a resume. And again, only do relevant skills and interests. So if you are a non-native English speaker, for example, you could write that you have, that you can speak English, that you're fluent, or that you can read and write in English. For example, this is something that you want to highlight. Or if you have specific experience with something like web design, that might be valuable to your future lab group. And then last but not least, you can include references on your CV. And this is not references like a manuscript. These are professional references that are going to be individuals that the reader of the CV can call and contact for a professional recommendation for you. So these are going to be people that can vouch for you in your career. And I do just want to highlight that we do have a downloadable CV template, so you can reference these slides, but you can also check out Learning Nexus on letpub.com and have a downloadable template in Word format for you to use from there. So that's all I have for the CV, and I want to jump right into the manuscript cover letter, which is another essential academic document that I'm sure many of us have either experience writing or are going to be writing very soon. So the basics, cover letters are very important because they do ultimately or can impact a journal editor's decision to consider your manuscript further. They're another way or an additional opportunity to convince editors that your work or that your paper is important and novel and appropriate to that journal. Many editors use cover letters to screen whether authors can follow basic instructions. So this is a really important point. So what you want to do in your cover letter is really give a good impression that you've read the author guidelines for the journal, that you've included all the necessary components in your cover letter, but also in your manuscript. So the cover letter is going to be the first thing that a journal editor reads along with the abstract of your work. So you want it to be a professional, polished document and basically illustrate that you can read and follow the instructions and that you're taking your manuscript submission seriously. Most likely, you're going to have to include the following that I've listed here as part of your cover letter. You always want to include the editor's name as well as the journal name. You can find this by going on the journal's website or downloading their author guidelines. You'll want to include your specific manuscript title, as well as what type of article you're submitting, whether it's a review article, original research, a case report, for example. You'll want to include the submission date of the manuscript submission to the journal itself. And then you're going to want to provide kind of a very, very brief overview of what your manuscript is bringing to the table. And again, I've underlined the word brief here because a cover letter should only be a maximum of 1 page. So you have to have very brief background on the work that you're doing and the research questions you're addressing. A brief overview of the methods. This is probably only going to be intertwined within 1 sentence when you're describing what you did, because you should be really focusing on the principal findings and the significance of your work in your cover letter. You'll also have to include the corresponding author contact information. So as the person who's submitting and likely writing the cover letter, that's going to be you. And most likely you will have to include a statement that your manuscript has not been previously published. It's not under consideration at any other journal at the same time. And that on behalf of all of your co-authors, everyone has granted approval for submission. So these points that I've listed here are things that are probably 95% of the time you're going to have to include those in a cover letter. You will also encounter some of these other options which are commonly requested. And again, this is something that is either going to be indicated to you directly by the journal editor is required, or you'll have to find out this information on the journal author guidelines or on the website. You may have to provide a short list of similar articles to indicate that your work being submitted to the journal will reach the same readership. You might have to list information that you and your co-authors have been previously published associated with an article in this journal or elsewhere. If you have any discussion with the editor about your specific manuscript, you want to indicate, you want to mention that information. If you have potential reviewers, this is something that you can do sometimes in the submission system, but sometimes in the cover letter, and this will be indicated to you in the guidelines. So you want to indicate those potential reviewers as well as their contact information, which will help the editor find peer reviewers for you. And if there are any excluded reviewers due to conflicts of interest or otherwise, you want to make sure to indicate that in the cover letter as well, in addition to providing justification for why those reviewers are excluded. And last but not least, you may also have to put in any sort of other disclosures. So if there's any compliance with ethical standards that needs to be stated, any other conflicts of interest, such as financial interests, any comments related to copyright, et cetera, those may also be required of you in your cover letter. So it's a lot of information to add into a cover letter that is very short. To help you with that, I do want to indicate things that you should not be including in your cover letter. It's important to remember that the editor might not be exactly in your scientific discipline, and therefore you should avoid using any sort of excessive jargon or a lot of acronyms that are unfamiliar. This will increase the readability of your cover letter and make the novelty and significance of your work easier to understand. You also want to avoid any over embellishment of your research findings. So while it's tempting to use words such as novel or transformative in your cover letter to really kind of bolster up your research and highlight the significance, you should try to avoid these statements because they show bias on your part. And these are statements that'll make an editor kind of get a bad impression right off the bat. You also want to avoid any sort of text that discusses you or your co-author's reputation. It's likely the editor may know who you are to begin with, but even if they don't want you, again, showing bias to your research group. It's the science that they're evaluating, not your reputation. And you want to avoid any sort of irrelevant information. Again, you want to be as focused as possible in your cover letter, to the point and concise. So you want to keep your cover letter to a maximum of 1 page. And it's always also important to avoid humor. Just because writing takes away any sort of the human element, you can't see a face, you can't see facial expressions, you can't see hand movements. A simple joke can be easily misinterpreted. So we suggest just avoiding humor in most professional communication. So with that, I want to jump into a template that I provided for you for this cover letter. Everything that is in a square bracket in this template is where you would be inserting your specific information. So whether that's the name of the journal editor, the name of the journal, your information, etc. That's where the revisions are on your part. The texts I have here shown in orange are just little tips to help you along your way. So the beginning of your cover template, up in the top left corner, is probably going to be who you're addressing your cover letter to. So that's going to be your journal editor of a specific journal, the submission date, as I indicated, and then an official salutation. So dear Dr., Mr. and Mrs., and then the editor's last name. Again, it is really important to use their last name if known, but if not, you can use dear editor-in-chief or dear managing editor. After this, your first paragraph or couple of sentences is really just going to be your declaration that you're submitting your manuscript to the journal. And then followed with that kind of this elevator pitch about the main significance of your work. And before I continue, I also want to indicate that while I've written that these are paragraphs, a cover letter, a paragraph might only be 1 or 2 sentences, and a typical paragraph is much more, 3 to 5 or so. But since your cover letter is so short, it's okay to have paragraphs that are really only 1 or 2 sentences to get the point across quickly. When you want to have that 1 or 2 sentence pitch to summarize your study design, this is where you can use phrases like, our findings confirm something, they corroborate another researcher's work, or if it's something new, they suggest something or they reveal. So those little orange tidbits there can help you kind of start to formulate your sentences for your cover letter. The next paragraph to follow this will be kind of a little bit of background and then justifying why your work is important for the readership of that particular journal. It's important to kind of look on the journal's website, specifically the journal's aim and scope, and have a sentence in there that says specifically why this paper is appropriate for that journal's mission. This is where you want to really understand the journal's audience, indicate why your research question had to be addressed and why it's important. And if your research is building off someone else's research, whether it's your own or an article published within that journal, for example, this is a good place to use that. Following on this, your next paragraph again could be highlighting whether your manuscript expands on prior research. If not, you don't need to include that information. And then getting towards the end of your cover letter is where you're going to be putting some more of those necessary elements. So underneath paragraph 4, I have the information or some example text of where we're indicating that each author has approved that the manuscript has not been previously published, it's not under consideration, and they're all satisfied with the submission of the manuscript itself. Importantly, if you have presented your research in a conference or at some sort of event, you do also want to indicate that, which is what I have here in orange text for you as some template text for that. If you do are required to indicate potential reviewers or referees, you do also want to put that into your cover letter. This here is some example test of how you can do that. Sometimes it's good and very clear to the journal editor if you bullet point those potential reviewers. And you, of course, want to provide their email because that is how the journal editor will contact them. Most often, you'll be asked to include 3 to 5 reviewers. Please provide the number that is requested by the journal. And oftentimes reviewer or referee are used by different journals. Please use the word that your target journal uses. And to end your cover letter, you'll want to often go out with a conflict of interest statement or maybe a thank you to the journal editor for considering your manuscript for review. And then you want to sign your name. I often say just use one format. So sincerely, best regards, something like that. You don't need to use multiple different levels to sign off. Oftentimes you want to type your name, but if you do have a little JPEG or a picture of your formal signature, it's also good to include that. And then you want to indicate that you are the corresponding author and then followed by your standard titles from where you're working, as well as your contact information. So that brings your cover letter to a close. So again, lots of information to include in one document itself. So it is pretty difficult, but hopefully this template will help get you there. And again, you can use this as a jumping off point, but it must be tailored to the manuscript and to the journal that you're submitting to. And last but not least, we do have another downloadable template for the cover letter. So again, use this information provided here, as well as the template that we have online. So the next document that I want to talk about today is the response to reviewers document. And just to bring us back to base of where we would be in the peer review process. So this is after you submitted your manuscript, most likely with a cover letter that you've drafted. The journal editor has sent your manuscript out for peer review, and now you've received comments back from the peer reviewers as well as the journal editor, and you have revisions requested, whether they're minor or they're major. And it's your responsibility now to revise your manuscript accordingly and provide a response to reviewers document upon your resubmission. So if you have been with me before, you may have seen these, but there are kind of 3 golden rules to use when responding to reviewer comments. The first is to answer completely. So as an author, you have the responsibility to respond to every query raised by the editor or the reviewers in this document. You want to be crystal clear and concise. Remember, editors view thousands of papers and revisions. So if a template is provided, use it. It will make them happier. It will make it easier for them. And hopefully that will make the whole process easier for you. One big tip is to basically copy and paste all of the reviewer and editor's questions into a Word document to get started, and then make a point-by-point response to all of those comments. And again, I'll provide a template after this to show you what I mean. You also want to clearly state which parts of your manuscript have been revised. And sometimes you can copy and paste certain chunks of text from your revised manuscript into the response letter, which will allow them to see the changes you've made all in one document, which really saves time and effort on their part. The second golden rule is to always answer politely. While it may be tempting sometimes and reviewer comments can be harsh, it's really important to not criticize the reviewer or their comment. Remember that all of the comments will be sent back to the same round of reviewers and the same editor, so you need to be polite and professional. One way to do so is to think of your editors and reviewers as collaborators. They have, after all, spent the time and effort to improve your manuscript and make it more suitable or polished for the journal that you're submitting to, so you do want to be cordial. And by doing so, of course, you want to say thank you for their efforts put forward, but this is something that you do not want to do excessively. You can say thank you at the beginning of your cover letter, within a couple of responses throughout, and then at the end, but do not say thank you for every comment that they make. This is seen as repetitive and it's not necessary. Importantly, the last golden rule is to answer with evidence. And what I mean is that you need justification for your comments, or you need to add references if you're stating something that's well known in the literature. It's also important to understand that if there's a disagreement between what you believe is correct and you have references to support this, or that you have data or analyses to support your point, it's okay to not agree with a reviewer and to not take their requested revisions, as long as you can politely and professionally refute what they're saying with evidence. That is okay. So you need to provide a coherent argument that's supported by evidence, clearly state the reasons for why you disagree and why you're having this rebuttal, and do not simply say we disagree with no justification. That will not satisfy the editor or the reviewer, and that could potentially lead to rejection. So again, you need to elaborate on why you disagree and provide evidence and reasoning for not completing the revision. So jumping into the response letter template, at the beginning of a response letter that you write, you'll want to have your same professional greeting. So dear Dr., Mr., and Mrs., and then it's often addressed to the editor because then they will send that to the reviewer. So again, address the editor by name if known. If not, you can use editor-in-chief or managing editor, but very likely the name will be provided to you with that round of peer reviewer comments. I won't read this entire text here, but again, anything in orange is something that you can use to where you should be inputting your own information. Near the end of this paragraph, I say that all changes are highlighted in red, and I change the text to red. You can be very clear in this way. We suggest that you change the font color, not the shading behind the font. Some of us like to highlight the text instead of changing the font color. While that definitely brings the text out and you won't miss it, it makes it very hard to read. So try to change the font color instead of highlighting. But main point here is you want to start the response letter off professionally, politely. You want to say thank you. You want to make sure that the editor knows what manuscript you are dealing with, and then you want to jump right into the comments. The way that I like to structure my response letters is I structure them by comments from the specific reviewers. So I often have a title here that says comments from reviewer number 1. And then very clearly, you want to indicate what is a reviewer comment and what is your author response. This is critical because if an editor can't really decipher this quickly, they're going to get frustrated and it's not going to lead to a good outcome. So there's a little bit of formatting to do on your part, but again, just make this very clear. Again, you can say thank you in response. Thank you for pointing out some sort of mistake or error that you've done. You can indicate that you agree with the comment, that you've revised accordingly, and then you explain how you've revised. If possible, you want to put the page and line numbers where the revisions can be found, again, just to make things easy for the reviewers and the editors. I have another example of a comment and response function here too. Again, these are examples of things that you agree to change, and then some different wording structures that you can use within your own responses. Say that's all the comments from reviewer 1. We have a few other ones. Sometimes they can be short and sweet. It's okay. You don't need to have extensive clarification. For example, if someone asks you to use a different acronym instead of the one that you did use, all you have to say is, thank you, we have revised the text accordingly. And you do not, in that case, need to indicate every page number and every line number that you changed an acronym. Your efforts will be clear. Once you've finished all of the comments from one reviewer, again, you need to answer every comment, even if it's just a comment and not a request for revision, just indicate that you've received that comment and you're considering it. In this case, you would follow on to your next reviewer. In this case, I've made it reviewer 2. It could be reviewer 3, 4, and 5. Oftentimes, you may encounter a comment that you don't quite disagree with, and that's what I have here as the comment 1 from reviewer 2. A good way to start your response is to validate what that reviewer has said. So indicate that they have raised an important point, or this is something that is currently controversial in the literature. So you want to indicate that you understand where the reviewer is coming from, but then you need to indicate that you are choosing not to revise because of a certain reason. And again, you want to have this with clear reasoning and supporting evidence. Last but not least, after you've done all of the comments from the reviewers, if there are any additional revisions that you and your co-authors have decided to do in addition to the revisions requested by the reviewers or the editor, it's important to indicate what those additional revisions are for transparency and clarity. So make sure that you have a separate section dedicated to that and add in those additional revisions. The way to sign off your response letter is often to indicate that you've proofread your document one more time to eliminate all spelling and grammatical errors, and that you look forward to hearing about your next, about your resubmission. And if there are any further comments, you want to welcome those to you to indicate that you are a very workable and collegial individual. Again, you want to sign off. It will be your name and your signature of you as the corresponding author, and then the date as well. I do have one more point here, is that instead of structuring by comments by reviewer, you can also structure by section. But again, you always need to make sure what is clear as a question or a comment by the reviewer and what is the author response. So last but not least, I want to spend a few minutes here just discussing email etiquette, because this is truly very likely the main form of communication that we all deal with these days. And it's really important to be professional in your emails, because it showcases, again, who you are as a researcher and really a person. And why we decided to talk about professional email writing today is because messages can be easily misinterpreted. Again, you don't have the facial expressions, you don't have the hand gestures to go along with them. So simple text can be misinterpreted in a negative way sometimes. So in general, you want to always be professional. You want to address the people on the other end of your email with their proper titles. In academia, this might often be doctor. You don't need to use proper titles once you've established a good relationship with someone. So perhaps you're not using, you're on a first name basis with your mentor or your advisors or your peers. But if you're reaching out to someone for the first time, or if it's a journal editor, for example, you always want to address them with their proper title. Again, unless you have a really good rapport with somebody, you should always be using complete sentences. And you should not be using any sort of emojis or emoticons or anything like that that you would be using in text messaging. You want to make sure to avoid all of that with emails. It's also important to not overuse the exclamation point in emails for professional correspondence. And very importantly, please proofread all of your emails, just as you would all of the documents that I've been talking about today. It's important to avoid any spelling or grammar mistakes. Many of us may be students that are listening in right now. So it's important that if you are making a request over email that you use the conditional tense. So instead of you declaring that that you and your advisor, for example, are going to meet up tomorrow at a specific time to discuss a specific thing, you want to kind of ask the question. So instead of let's meet up tomorrow at noon to discuss research, you want to say, are you available tomorrow to discuss research? This might seem a very small thing to you at this point, but once you get further along in your career, you're probably just going to be even busier. And having that flexibility in that question is very professional. So try to use that if you are doing requests. Again, I just want to reiterate to avoid any grammar and spelling mistakes. If it's a new recipient that is receiving an email from you for the first time, an occasional mistake is no big deal, I think. You know, we're all writing our emails pretty fast, but we do want to try to avoid this. But unfortunately, if there are many of them, it could be viewed as sloppy work, and that would give a bad impression of you right off the bat. So again, please proofread. One tip here is that sometimes we're not really sure if hitting the enter key on our keyboard is going to just automatically send the email or if it's going to actually just return to the next line. So one way to avoid accidentally sending out an unfinished email or an unpolished email is to write the subject line, write the main body text, and then after you've proofread everything, that's when you put in the recipient's email address. That way you don't have any risk of accidentally sending the email before it's actually complete. Other tips are be concise. And what I mean by this is that we all get hundreds of emails a day. And if you don't get that yet, you probably will eventually. So you want to minimize the questions that you ask per email. If you send your advisor an email with 25 questions, they're bound to miss one. So minimize the questions per email and keep focused to a specific topic. Along those lines, your subject line should be clear and it should make sense with the main body text of the email. And only use what's known as CC, BCC, and reply all when necessary. So basically only bring in the folks that really need to hear what you want to say in this email because people are busy otherwise. Importantly, CC, that stands for carbon copy. So anybody that you CC on the email will also see the email and basically be copied on it. BCC stands for blind carbon copy. So this is another really important reason why you always want to be professional. Someone could BCC you. So your mentor could email you. And if they BCC a committee member, you're not going to know that that committee member is seeing the email and your responses. So be very careful and be professional because you never know when that might be happening. Importantly, you always want to use the correct email address. And what I mean is your professional email address. Anything that's related to your career, to employment, you want to use your institutional email address for any work-related emails. It's okay to have a personal email, of course, for any online shopping or something that you want to do, but make sure that you don't submit a manuscript with your personal email. And you should invest in creating a professional email signature. And really what that means is just a sign off with your contact information. Often includes your name. You might have some links such as your personal website, the company name that you work for, and your professional title. This is also just a quick way for anyone who's interested in contacting you again to get a little bit more information. And before we jump into the Q&A, I do want to address a pretty common question, which is, what if my email is super urgent? There's a deadline approaching. How do I be professional in that manner? And the general rule is that you want to give your recipient at least 1 day to respond. So what that means is that you need to be organized and plan ahead. If you are trying to achieve a deadline, you can't email your colleagues or your mentor within hours of that deadline and expect them to drop everything that they're doing and respond to you. So you need to really kind of factor in a little bit of grace period here for them to follow up. If you put yourself in their shoes, if you're, in the lab doing extremely important experiment, you're not going to be checking your email. So why should the other person at the other end of the line? So please try to give individuals at least 1 day to respond before you send another email. And if you do need to send a follow-up, please be very polite, and you can indicate why it's so important. So if there is that encroaching deadline. Most importantly, do not send multiple emails within a few hours' time. You don't want to overload somebody's inbox. It will give a bad impression. We're all busy, and I think just being professional in general is understanding that people have different things on their plates. So again, don't send multiple emails within a few hours. So before we move on to Q&A, I just want to highlight that we do have a great article written by one of our associate editors at LetPub, Nate Booten, and check that out if you want to learn more information about the essentials of email. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. Again, if you have any questions related to any of the topics that I discussed today, any of those documents, feel free to ask Clark and I.
Excellent, AV. You promised details, and you definitely came through as usual. So I think this entire topic is detail, right? That seems to be what matters, because it's just these little fine lines of you're giving a certain impression, particularly in the cover letter, like you said, in the response letter, and your correspondence. I think that's really important. We have a lot of the authors that we deal with. There's oftentimes a lot of questions about how to navigate that issue with reaching out to the journal, reaching out to the editor, and we always encourage them to. And so now it's nice to show them how to do that appropriately. So that's great. And I actually have some maybe follow-up questions on that, but I want to get to everybody else's questions first. We don't have a ton here to start. I assume they're going to start streaming in pretty quickly. This first one is one that I really like, though. It's pretty simple. What do you do in the situation where a reviewer wants you to cite their papers? And I think what we're thinking here is when it's quite overt, because it might even be their own papers as well. I would even say if they recommend that you cite papers from that specific journal. So sometimes it's okay to say that you don't have the relevant literature here. Can you cite it? And maybe you point out specific papers that either aren't yours or aren't from that journal. But there's two situations where the reviewers might request you to cite literally their own papers, or papers specifically from that journal, which I don't think is really consistent with what you're trying to do. You're trying to cite the relevant literature, whether it's in that journal or not. So how would you handle this? And in particular, how do you handle that response, like within the template? Is there like a quick and dirty way to do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. So it can be tricky because, you want to satisfy the reviewer and the editor. And if they're asking you to do something that perhaps you don't think is right or you don't agree with, or for just in general, the literature they're asking you to cite isn't relevant. Again, this is one of those examples where you may disagree with the request that's requested of you. So again, you just need to be polite and professional. You need to acknowledge that it's a good suggestion, but that you want to keep your topic focused on the most relevant literature. And that's really what I want to say there. It can be very difficult because there are issues with self-citation and things like that journals bring forward. And sometimes, unfortunately, the journal editor can be the person that's pushing that on you. But again, in theory, there's likely anyways you're going to be citing some papers from that journal because it's the most appropriate readership, and that's where you're submitting. So perhaps you can always make a compromise where you add one more article that is truly relevant to your work, but you don't add the 5 articles that they suggest because there might be a limit on references, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I've noticed journals now doing it. I've seen it both in the author guidelines as
Hmm.
well as in the sort of form letter that the editor is sending back. There will be language in there that indicates um, if um, if you're being requested to include specific citations that you don't feel are appropriate or that you're uncomfortable with coming directly from the reviewer, something like that. It's that type of language that you can reach out to the editor. Type of
Hmm.
thing. So they're actually
Exactly.
they're understanding it now. Ideally, the editor steps in and does something about that if a reviewer is doing that, but quite often they don't, and so it's up to you. Usually, it's easy because if they think you've undercited, you can find an article, you might find a couple articles outside the journal, a couple articles from that
Hmm.
journal. But if they're asking you specifically cite theirs, if you really missed it, you can just go ahead and cite
Right.
it. It's not inappropriate to cite it, but it is a bit inappropriate for them to specify, unless they want to point out that this citation is like basically congruent with another citation that you have, and they may want to consider it. If they do it that way, it's probably okay. But otherwise, if they're just saying you need 3 more from this journal, or
Yeah.
you need to cite these 2 papers and one of them includes them on it, then you should perhaps do it if you think it's appropriate. But I would also reach out to the journal, to the editor, and let them know that you're not really comfortable with reviewers doing that in the process and you don't necessarily think it's appropriate. I think that's a contribution to science because it shouldn't be occurring anyway.
Right.
Plus, I think it sets you up well. It's a little bit of a cheat code. If a reviewer is doing something inappropriate like that, it makes it harder for the editor to side with them on maybe other issues. If the reviewer is
Hmm.
being tough on you in other ways and they're making their own mistakes in the review, it makes the editor question whether they can just take everything from that reviewer at face value. So if the reviewer is
Okay.
giving you other problems that you think are not legitimate, and then they're also doing something like this, I think it is worth reaching out. But again, following the rules you put up, AV, in terms of email correspondence and how you go about that would be great. Okay, yeah, that was an excellent question. Okay, so this can get back to the form of the response letter and maybe like quick sentences that you can go through. So what do you do when you have the reviewer who seems, the content is very clearly in the manuscript answering the question that they asked. It's just they haven't gotten to it. They didn't go to the supplemental info section, or it's explained in a later section, and they're just, they got something in their head off the abstract or off the introduction, and they didn't bother to realize that it was answered later on.
Hmm.
What's the etiquette for responding to that? Do you have an easy way to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's pretty common, so you're definitely not alone out there with that being something that's happened to you. What you want to say, you just need to bring to the attention that the reviewer may have missed something, but you can do it very, very politely. Sometimes you can say, I apologize if this wasn't clear, but this information can be found in the supplement or in the discussion. And then you just draw the reviewer's attention to the line numbers or the page numbers or the section number. And that's really all that you need to say. You can indicate that it was provided in the original version of the manuscript, and that you were sorry for any confusion that led to this question. That's all you
Yeah.
need to do, in my opinion. What do you think, Clark?
Yeah. What I tend to do there, I think, is because quite often the criticism is legitimate if they
Mm-hmm.
don't realize the information is there. It's not that it's
Right.
illogical, and so it's right. And so I just agree with them fully in
Mm-hmm.
that, like, you so recognize their point, but then say indicate the material in such and such section on such and such line, and then repeat that information addresses this concern, and you can sort of specify it. So recognizing that their point is totally valid and just pointing out where it can be found. And
Exactly.
if there's something you can improve, even if it's just tweaking the wording a little bit and it didn't really matter, just saying that you did something, right? So like you direct them there and then say, in addition, we noticed this, and so we made some slight wording changes so that this is more clear in
Mm-hmm.
addressing your concern. And it was probably clear to begin with, they just didn't see it, but showing that you took it seriously, even though it was really an oversight on the reviewer's part. I think that helps, like you said, making them a collaborator, getting them on your side a little bit in that
Yeah,
regard. So
exactly.
again, one of these little soft things that may be soft strategies that can help you a little bit. So,
Yep.
okay. So the cover letter, how important is it, particularly as it relates to the manuscript? Because a lot of times journals will reject with no reason, right? So you get a desk rejection, and quite often they use a blanket statement of like, it's not a good fit for the journal, which can mean like scope, or they just don't think it's impactful enough for their readership, that type of thing. So even when they have a good cover letter, as you've outlined, AV, um, what might be going on? Is there anything that else that they can do? Because the whole point of the cover letter is to maybe preempt things, to show someone right off the bat that you're good at these checklists, that you've formatted correctly and all these things. So is there anything else you can do in the cover letter to try to avoid that desk rejection?
Oh, that's a really good question. I know that we have recently had some guest speakers associated with some of our webinars that do really indicate that having a cover letter, even if it's optional, is really something that you should do, because it's that additional opportunity for you to really highlight the novelty and impact of your work. And as I indicated, you not just want to do that for your manuscript, but you want to really make the direct tie between why your manuscript is appropriate for the journal. And I guess my suggestion is really to make that as clear as possible. Use language that is in the journal's aim and scope online, and put that in a direct connection within a couple of sentences associated with your manuscript directly. Like, our manuscript titled blah aligns with the journal's aim and scope of this because this. And I think that would be as clear as possible, because I think one of the most common rejections that we all get is that the manuscript is outside the journal's aim and scope, and that's the rejection that you get. So if you can really make a good argument for that in your cover letter up front and as clear as possible, I can't promise that you're going to obviously be accepted or put out for peer review, but it's at least a good step in the right direction.
That's a probability game, right? So every little thing sort of ups that and gives you a better opportunity. I would echo that 100%, what you said about pulling from the journal's language. The journal has committed to language, right? They've put something out there and they can't take it back. So when they have the scope and these things, line your material up against their scope and make it difficult for the associate, like, because they still might want to reject it. They just don't think it's impactful enough. But the better you line it up, the harder it is for them to do that. And they might, even though they don't want to, they might say, like, they put me in a position where I feel like it wouldn't be right. Like, they've made a clear point and I just feel like I can't refute that. And so I at least have to send it out to reviewers. You can maybe force their hand into that situation. So that's why it's important the form language is important, right? Just showing that you can go through the formality and do it perfectly and not have mistakes, because automatically just in the back of their head, they're thinking like, okay, this is good work, even though they haven't really seen it yet. Right. But also hinging on these details, particularly, it's a good point you make about always doing a cover letter. That's something that has, as you said, some of our guest speakers have brought up several times, that you should do it even if it's optional, which for me, for the work I was involved in, a lot of times the key point for the journals that I was submitting to was mechanistic work. And so a lot of authors really had to sell the mechanistic aspect. Fortunately for me, ours was clearly mechanistic, like purely mechanistic data. That was the novelty of it. And so the cover letter might not have been as important for me, but it might be important for other people. And so identifying what that little item is that's sort of the barrier for publication in that journal, and being sure to emphasize it in your cover letter, I think is really helpful for getting past those desk rejections. Even if the editor's like, I don't really want to, I don't think this is like the work that it will eventually get published, they might feel obligated to send it through peer review because you've matched it up so well in that regard.
Exactly.
So that's a good way to do it. But again, it's not perfect.
Yeah. Another quick point is, I mentioned that if you had any sort of correspondence with the editor beforehand, to mention that in the cover letter. So if you reach out to the journal editor before you even submit to see if your manuscript would be appropriate for the journal, and they say yes, you absolutely want to reiterate that information in your cover letter, because a different journal editor could be coming on board, but they're probably going to move forward with the previous journal editor's guidance. Or that journal editor may, again, see thousands of manuscripts and different cover letters, and they may forget that they had a correspondence with you. And that could, again, sway their decision to sending your manuscript out for peer review. So again, add in all those details if you can.
Excellent. This is another tricky one. So how to address comments that are difficult to understand or unclear. This happens quite often, in particular because perhaps you're an ESL author, but there's a very good chance that you'll also get an ESL reviewer. And so if you have comments that are either language difficult to understand or just unclear, they're too vague, what's the polite way to deal with those and try to get the right information?
Well, you said the right adjective right there. You want to be polite about it. I actually had an issue with this where I really just couldn't decipher what the reviewer specifically wanted. They wanted some sort of change to a figure, and I really just could not figure out what it was. And I just clearly said, thank you for your comment. Unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure what you are asking for, but I understand that you wanted revisions done to this figure. As such, I have reevaluated the figure and modified it as follows. So you want to, again, like you mentioned, show that you are doing some slight modifications if you can decipher what the general component is about. If it is a very vague comment about, shortening a section, but they don't say what should be cut, for example, from the section, you can say that you appreciate their comment and that you have reevaluated your section, you've reread it, you've realized that certain material wasn't necessarily relevant, and as such you have shortened your discussion section or whatever section it was that they added. So again, you want to acknowledge their comment. It's okay to be clear that you didn't quite understand what they were talking about, but that their comment did lead you to modify or revise your manuscript, and it has in some beneficial way. What do you think?
Yeah, just like being polite has a big effect, I think being a little bit earnest has an effect too. So it's not that you're just like, I don't understand you, you're criticizing me, and you're not even clear, and so creating some animosity. It's more the idea of, you're not quite sure exactly what they would like to see here, and so you ask them a return question of like,
you can always
are you
do
looking
that.
Would you like me to do this? Would you like me to do that? And show an earnestness because you realize there must be something problematic and you want to get it resolved. It's not that you're just upset that you can't understand. You think that's just a bunch of bunk, right? The other thing you can do is also with the editor is you can let the editor know this point from reviewer 2 was unclear, and so I tried to ask them some questions, be polite about it. But if you want, because sometimes they'll connect you outside of the formal next round of response letter, right? So the editor will just send your comments of trying to get clarity on that issue to the reviewer and let them give a response. And again, that fosters the more collaborative nature. So instead of being a potential point of animosity, so you can do that too. Just point out to the editor, I didn't really understand this one. If you want to send my response or questions to the reviewer and they can give a little bit better feedback, I could make other changes before and we could get it resolved sort of outside that. That's a really good way to do it. So it doesn't feel like there's animosity when you see everybody's review comments, right?
Correct.
So
yeah.
That's another option if you think it's particularly difficult.
Yeah. For one of those responses, you can always just end it with, if you require further clarification, please don't hesitate to let me know. Just a phrase like that, indicating that you're open for further criticism, because, perhaps you didn't answer the question that they were looking for, or perhaps you did. So it's good to just cover all your bases, I guess, in that way.
It's very good for the vague ones, like you said, too. If they want you to shorten something, or they say like, oh, this is bad or something like that, and you don't really think it is, you can make minimal changes and say you've made changes. But if there's other items that you think are problematic, please specify them and we can take care of them. And then it puts it back on the reviewer. Don't let reviewers give you vague stuff. You make changes if they give you vague, but you don't need to do it too strongly. You can always just leave it up to them. If you need more than this, it's up to you to tell me, sort of deal. That can be an effective way. Okay. This is a quick and easy one. So should the article be sent with the cover letter or send the cover letter and wait?
Oh, with a cover letter.
Yeah, you can always send them together. It is possible because sometimes you send a letter to the editor to see if they're interested in a certain review article, right? And so that could be kind of treated as a cover letter because you're going to summarize the study a little bit. And you might not even have the manuscript at that point. But yeah, in general, original research articles, anything else, your cover letter goes with it as part of the submission documents.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, let's try to run through a few more. Okay, if you submit a paper for a period of time but didn't get an answer, how long should you wait to email the editor to ask about the result? This is difficult. You you might want to offer an opinion, and then I have a suggestion about how to deal with these time emails too and actually get a response from the editor. So any advice on time length that you would wait?
Oh, that's really hard. It's extremely variable by discipline and by journal. There are sometimes journals provide some clarity about how long something should take. So if you're if they say their time to decision is 30 days and it's been 40 days, I think that you are okay to politely request the editor what the status is. But before you do any of that, if there is an online submission system, oftentimes that gives you the status of your manuscript, whether it's under review or waiting for decision by editor or something like that. So make sure you know the status and, watch your manuscript. If it's only just gotten to the editor's desk to make the final decision within the past couple of days, wait a few more days. So I would say don't blindly email really, really quickly. You need to, I guess, do some information gathering and then make a professional and polite decision. But Clark, what is your tip? I'm sure everyone wants to know.
So with these, again, like you said, length should be, we're scientists, right? So always try to use evidence. So if you can find if the journal reports an average turnaround time, wait till after that time, right? But the other item you can do is, because a lot of people don't get responses, right? And it's just because there's a heavy workload and it's hard with email. And so if you are able to email the editor directly, always make it easier to answer. If the editor has 10 emails from authors asking like, where's my manuscript? Like, it's been quite a while, that type of thing. They're going to answer the easy ones. So set it up for them. Most of the time it's because they don't have reviewers. If you're just worried that it's stuck somewhere, always put something like, hey, I was just reaching out to see if you're just a little bit behind on this, or if you're having trouble, perhaps you're having trouble finding reviewers. I could offer additional recommendations if you're having trouble placing it, that type of thing. So make it easy for them to answer, because also the editor feels angst, right? The editor feels pressure, like they want to do a good job and everything, and they may have trouble placing it. And so if they see someone who's just being collaborative like that, like just want to see where it's at, so I can make a good decision on what I should do with it, maybe whether I should pull it out and go somewhere else, or if you're probably not going to be able to get reviewers for it, just be honest with me type thing, the editor will jump on that email to respond to you. Whereas the other ones where they sense some animosity or they feel pressure because they feel like they're behind and you're badgering them about it, then that might be the one they kind of just like ignore, and it just like stays in the ether. So give them easy ways to answer. That's, I think, can be very helpful.
Yeah, that's good. Again, you want to be collaborative with the editor, and I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah. This question you already answered. So is it appropriate to write Dear Editor when you don't know the editor's name? I think your advice is always give the editor's name if you have it, for sure.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. And if you don't, again, use the title that you can find online. So yeah, Dear Editor does work.
Yeah, and it's based on if the editor's name is easily found, you should use it. If you had to search forever and you can't find it, it's okay not to, right? So like there should be expectations. The people at the journal know whether they represent these things well, and if it's easily found on the website. And so if it's easily found, make sure it's there. If it's not easily found, don't sweat it.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there was one other item I mistyped a W in the chat on our assets page. So I will re-enter that into the Q&A when you take this next question, AV. But if you go to letpub.com and then you go to our Learning Nexus, it's under the core on the far right. The Learning Nexus will have a category in there called Career Assets. But again, I will paste the direct link again in the chat here in just a second. Let's get into our next one. Let me just find our next most upvoted. Avi, could you give me what's the biggest mistake? This asks most common. So what's a common big mistake that you see in response letters that automatically, like when you're a reviewer, puts a bad taste in your mouth as sort of like a fatal flaw that suggests that you really don't want this to get through?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I think one of the most fatal flaws is if authors don't provide justification for their reasoning. So if there's a response letter where there's extensive comments provided by the peer reviewers and every author response is just, we revised this, and it's just copy and pasted underneath every single reviewer response, number one, that's not going to lead you to acceptance of a manuscript. Again, you're not providing any answer with evidence. You're not necessarily being polite. It doesn't even seem like you read the reviewer comments, and there's no indication of what has actually been changed to improve your manuscript based on the reviewer's suggestions. So again, you're not really being collaborative if you're doing that. You're showing minimal effort, if any effort, in creating the response letter. And I don't think that won't serve you well in the journal editor's eyes or the reviewers. You'll very likely either be rejected or you'll be asked for another round of revision, which could include a whole other round of peer review, which could be months long. So again, if you just copy and paste, we revise this, we revise this, we revise this with no other information, that's definitely discouraged.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me get a couple more. And then, as we said, what we're going to do is carry this Q&A over to peer ref. So anytime during the next month before our next webinar, AV and I are going to be on peer ref. We'll actually take these questions and add them to peer ref and start answering them. But you're all welcome to join us, re-ask your questions, elaborate on questions. In particular, if you have specific things about your experiences with a journal and you want to know how we would deal with that exact situation, that is a great place to have that discussion. So go over to www.peerref.com. And we'll be on there for the LetPub site, the LetPub webinar series. It's right on the home page. You can see the webinar discussion hub. So, but let's get a couple more. So I have two questions here that I'm going to sort of put together, and it's how to deal with the journal when they do a bad job in peer review.
Okay.
whether it's clearly that they go to a single reviewer, they only give you one peer reviewer, and that person might only have one publication and they're really a practitioner. This example here is a dentist who's not really like a researcher. Or you have a situation where you think a rebuttal letter is warranted because of something that occurred during the peer review process that you're uncomfortable with, you don't think meets quality standards. What can you do? Is it worth doing anything? What's your opinion? How do you deal with that, AV?
That's a really good question. It's a tricky question, appealing a decision or something like that. First and foremost, you need to really have a reason for doing so, because again, you're asking the journal editor and the journal to go through some hoops for you, and you're going to be spending a lot of time doing this as well. So you definitely want to be published in that journal, but of course you shouldn't be made to feel uncomfortable in any fashion. So if you have a reasoning behind it, and like a good solid reason other than just feeling frustrated that the reviewer didn't understand your work, for example, I think it's okay to reach out to the journal editor. There's also more than one editor at a journal, so you can reach out to a different individual to get their opinion on it. And before that, you should even reach out to your mentor, your advisor, and your peers for assistance, because perhaps they've gone through a similar situation and have real world advice for you about what to do in that manner. So I would say seek advice, probably first and foremost from your mentor if you're a student, or colleagues if you're an established scientist, and then reach out to the journal, perhaps a different journal editor if it's a situation with the editor themselves. What do you think, Clark? Do you have any specific advice?
I agree 100%. What you said, making sure, speaking to other people, speaking to your mentors, speaking to your colleagues, and speaking to journal staff at another journal, so maybe somebody you know, and determining whether your concerns are warranted in that regard.
Yeah.
And then my thing is, if a journal only sent it to one, particularly if this happens multiple times, but like if they're just sending it to one reviewer, if it's shoddy peer review, the question is, do you want to be publishing in that journal anyway? I think you should ask yourself, because as our attendee indicates here, likely it doesn't result in anything. So how much do you want to go through with that?
Exactly.
So consider whether maybe that's an appropriate journal that you have any interest in supporting, right? Because this is maybe an ethical concern. The other item is, it's like, for example, if it's self-citation, see these requests, particularly if it's like from the journal, like if the editor-in-chief's asking for it, and it's like, well, what's the point of going to the journal? The editor-in-chief is the journal. you can always go to COPE. I wouldn't worry about going to the institutions because it may create problems for you, and it's not really your responsibility to do that. It's the responsibility of the other organizations that exist. So COPE is a really good organization that deals with publishing ethics. Most of these journals are members of COPE. Most of these publishers are members of COPE. These people at these institutions, their institutions are members of COPE. So you can simply send an email to COPE reporting the situation. COPE will log that and archive it, and they can look at opportunities to pursue anything if it's really an issue or bring it to the journal's attention. So COPE can be the one to go point to a journal and indicate your editor-in-chief is creating a certain situation that's not consistent with our guidelines. And if you're going to be a member organization, that's not okay. So that's another, in the extreme circumstances where you feel doing the right thing is warranted, going to an organization like COPE to report what you think might be a problematic issue. Again, doing it politely, not super accusatory. That's a good way to feel like you've made some progress, but not embroil yourself in anything that's not going to get your paper published anyway. So just keep that in mind. That is always an option if you're getting frustrated with journals doing some of these types of things.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
I am going to call it there. We do have more questions. Again, we'll add these to the list and make sure that they get answered for you. I do want to give everybody a reminder. I reposted the asset webpage, so you can go to that webpage, and we have articles in our Learning Nexus that have career assets, have templates with explanations in them. Be sure to customize these templates for your exact use. We'll carry over the Q&A onto PeerRef, so please join us there. It's always a fun discussion. The other item is, I just very briefly, for some of our latecomers, I wanted to let you know this on-demand recording is available. The on-demand recording and also a certificate of completion, if that's something you need for continuing education credits, that type of thing. Those will both automatically be sent to you via email from Zoom within the next 24 hours. So after that period, give it a day. After that period, if you still don't have it, feel free to reach out to us. We'll make sure you get the link so you can view that on-demand recording. In addition, you can go to our YouTube page, because I think now we're pretty routinely posting these up as the new webinar each month. You can go ahead and go to our YouTube page. Also, we're anticipating in the future that we're also going to be going live on PeerRef. So you could be viewing us next month, if you join us for that conversation, live on PeerRef, and just start asking your questions there within our hub. We'll get them answered for you. So anything I missed, AV? Any last comments you wanted to provide?
No, I think that's it. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And if you're a newcomer, welcome. And if you've been with us before, it's great to have you back with us. So we hope to see you in the new year.
Yes, absolutely. Appreciate it, everyone. Be sure to follow us over on PeerRef, and we'll continue this Q&A. Thanks, AV. Have a good day, everyone.